Welcome to the Garage Gym Athlete Podcast, where we talk about fitness, health, and anything to help you become the most optimal human beings. Let's dive into it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Garage Gym Athlete Podcast. Jerred Moon here with Joe Courtney. What's up, Joe?
What's going on, man?
Not much. So we just finished a few days ago some blood lactate testing for Zone 2. You may have seen us post about it on social media, or if you follow me on social media, you probably saw me post about it. I got a lot of questions about it, and so we're going to dive into it a little bit more on the podcast today. So this will be the podcast listener-friendly deeper dive. We will also have a YouTube video of, us doing the lactate testing, filming, all that kind of stuff, and explanation. But this will be the deeper dive into blood lactate testing for Zone 2 and why you should or shouldn't think about doing it. I think that would be the ultimate, the takeaway is should you test your blood for lactate to find out what your true Zone 2 is? And so I think that's where I'll start. And I'm just going to talk about lactate real quick. And I'll try to keep this super high level because I'm not a chemist. I don't want to, I'm not a biologist, anything like that. I'm just trying to understand this from a coaching level. And then I want to bring that information down to an athlete level so people can understand it. So why do we even care about lactate? So we know why we care about Zone 2. And I kind of talked about that in my last podcast. So Zone 2 is really great for fat oxidation. It's kind of like where you're burning the most fat for energy, not necessarily losing the most fat, but where you're actually burning the most fat for energy. It helps you build a really strong aerobic base so you can run faster paces. You can build that base so you can go higher in your top end, end up building your VO2 max if you add in the right training on top of Zone 2 training. It's going to help you live longer. It's going to turn you into an aerobic monster, all those kind of things. So I already covered why you might want to do Zone 2. But where does lactate come into this? And I want to talk about that today because I think it's important. Lactate's like the real test of whether or not you're in Zone 2. So a great indicator of whether or not you're in bad shape would be how much lactate your body produces and how quickly. Because that's what we know to be true of someone who has, metabolic disease. They are going to, or metabolic syndrome. They're going to produce lactate very quick into exercise, and it's almost the only thing that they can do is burn glucose. They can't burn fat. So lactate is actually a byproduct of anaerobic metabolism. So without oxygen, I think is all we need to know. So lactate is a byproduct of that. So it's a way for your body to, when your body does anaerobic metabolism, it's trying to produce energy for the activity that you're doing. And a byproduct of that is lactate. And lactate is pretty much only used when glucose is broken down. So glucose gets broken down, and I'm not going to go too far into the weeds here, but it gets broken down into pyruvate. Okay, and so what happens is when you do really hard exercise, people normally start talking about lactate and lactate buildup and all this kind of stuff. But what's actually happening is hydrogen ions are being flooded into the body when you're doing really high intensity exercise. And then what happens is those hydrogen ions attach to pyruvate that's been broken down, which is glucose broken down. That's how you get lactate. So lactate is actually pyruvate and a hydrogen ion. And so lactate is actually stopping you from being acidic. It's stopping your body from being overly acidic and you dying. So that's the goal of lactate. And then your body can, if you bring in enough oxygen, your body can start to use lactate for fuel. It can bring it back in to the body, the liver, combine it back and then break it back down because it looks a lot like glucose when it gets combined, when two of them get combined, it can start being used for energy. But again, I'm not going into utilizing lactate for energy or going into all of that stuff. So lactate, big thing to remember, it's a byproduct of anaerobic without oxygen. So we all know Zone 2, running, cycling, those kind of things that you want to get better at, those are not anaerobic activities. Those are aerobic activities. And so we want to avoid lactate. Okay, that's the goal in Zone 2 training, is you want to avoid too much production of lactate. And the best way for me to describe this to someone is lactate production is like spending money on a credit card. Okay, so if you it's fun. Like spending money on a credit card can be fun because you just like spending money. You don't feel like it's real money. And then you get to the end of the month and you get the bill and maybe you spent more than you made. And now it's not fun anymore, right? That's how lactate production is. Because if your body is producing a lot of lactate and anaerobic metabolism, you're going to need more oxygen. And eventually your body can only bring in so much oxygen, and you can only clear and utilize so much lactate that your body's basically going to stop. So that's how lactate can stop you, is like you basically can't utilize it. You can't bring in enough oxygen for it to be used. Your body can't clear it. And so you're going to get that bill, like that credit card bill. And so that's what happens when you're producing too much lactate. That's when you can actually like fall off this cliff and you can no longer exercise. You can't push it anymore, right? So that's why you want to avoid lactate. Well, zone 2 is aerobic metabolism. So the threshold that they've kind of marked here is 2 millimole or less of blood lactate circulating. So if you're less than that, that's like the point at which your body is still relying on aerobic metabolism, and it's still able to utilize that lactate and re-break it down and utilize it for energy. So clearing it is like reusing it. And so that's what we want. And I wanted to give this quick primer on just lactate in general so people understand why the hell it even matters, why you might even want to think about it. Because if your body if it's producing too much lactate, again, you're playing that credit card game. You're writing checks that you can't cash, those kind of things. And so when you're in a purely aerobic state, your body is super efficient. It's burning primarily fat as energy. That's where you're at your fat max. So fat oxidation, fat burning is at the highest in zone 2. You're able to recycle lactate. And this is where you're stressing the mitochondria. And so if O2 is available, aerobic metabolism, pyruvate can go straight into the mitochondria, and it creates a crap ton of ATP, which is energy for the cell, right? And so this aerobic metabolism is our powerhouse. It's how we live most of our lives, right? Through aerobic metabolism, sitting here, walking, zone 2 exercise, all that kind of stuff. So that's the quick lactate lesson. So we're trying to avoid lactate in our zone 2 training. That's why we do a blood test to see how much lactate we have and see if it's below that 2 millimole threshold that we're talking about. So that's my lactate lesson. I don't know if you fell asleep, Joe, or if you're still paying attention, but did you have any questions about anything lactate related there?
That was definitely a lot. Some of the breakdown within the lactate is definitely new words that I've never even heard of. So
I know if I said pyruvate, some people might just click off the podcast and stop listening altogether. But I had to give the lesson. I had to do a quick breakdown.
So, yeah, I don't think I really have any questions or things to add.
Questions. You said it perfectly. Okay, so we'll get into what we did. So how we did our zone 2 test. Now I can get into just like what we did. It was Joe, myself, Mark Bishop, who's been a garage gym athlete for a long time. He actually came in town, and this is the test that we utilized. We weren't trying to find necessarily like max lactate production or anything like that. So we used our MAF zones as a baseline. So MAF, again, I answered this in my last zone 2 podcast. So if you take your age, so 180 minus your age, that gives you your baseline MAF zone 2 heart rate. So for us all being around the same age, 35, 36, we were in the 145, 144 range for our MAF zone. Now, MAF also says, if you listen to that zone 2 podcast, that you can add beats per minute. Like if you're a certain level of fitness or you haven't been sick, like I went over all that in the last zone 2 podcast just a few episodes ago. So go listen to that if you have any questions about how to calculate your number. But what we wanted to know is like, well, how accurate is that number? So we get this number, it says we should be at 145, but is it accurate? When we actually test blood lactate, is my blood lactate still below what it should be to be in zone 2? And so that's what we were doing. And so we would run, all three of us ran for an hour in total, and we would hop off the treadmill at 15-minute intervals to test our blood lactate and just to see where we were at. So I'm going to pull it up on the screen. If you are, on YouTube, you can see this. Let's see. Maybe you can pull it up. Oh, there we go. So what happened, and again, if you're listening only, I'll make sure that you understand it. I'll go with my results first. So my baseline, the heart rate I should be shooting for to be in zone 2 for me was 145. So I ran in 144 to 148 range for 15 minutes. And then I hopped off the treadmill and tested my blood lactate. My blood lactate at 15 minutes was 1.5 millimole. So well below where I could be to still be in zone 2. So then I took it up a notch. I went up to or no, I'm looking at marks. Sorry.
Yeah, I was
I
gonna
was
say that's
sorry, I
Mark.
was looking at marks. So anyway, I was at 1.7 and I was running at 148. So forget all that. I was running at 148 beats per minute, which is real close to my zone 2 number, and I was at 1.7. And so I was like, oh, okay, 1.7, not bad. I'm just going to increase it a little bit and see what happens. So I went up to 155 beats per minute. And then I actually hopped off at 30 minutes and my blood lactate came down to 1.6. So I'm still not pushing up against that zone 2 level. And so then for my third 15-minute run up to the 45-minute mark, I was like, I'm going to just push it. So I went above 160. I was probably averaging, I wasn't right at 160. I was probably like 163, 164, like above 160. So pretty high. And then I hopped off at 45 minutes. And then that's when my blood lactate was at 2.2. So I'm now out of zone 2. I'm in anaerobic energy production. I'm producing too much lactate. I would not be able to sustain it for very long. Well, at 160, zone 3, you could still sustain for long periods, but not like hours on end like you can with zone 2. So it's too high. So then I brought it back down to but the range of 150 to 155. I was probably hovering like 153, 154. And then my blood lactate dropped all the way down to 1.5, I think.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened so I get off, I have too much lactate, I lower my intensity, my body starts to clear the lactate, because that's what happens if you're fit and efficient. And then I came back down into zone 2 at this 150 to 155 range. And I could go over everyone else's results, but Joe's don't make any sense and Mark's are very similar to mine. We'll talk about that in a second. But ultimately, what I found, the big takeaway from all that, is my base math zone says, hey, you should be at 145. But I didn't know if I should add 5 or add 10 based on all of his questions. And now I know through 2 different tests in this blood lactate that I can go up to 155 and still be comfortably in zone 2. So that's a 10 additional beats per minute that I can add and still be in zone 2. So I could technically go up to 155 instead of 145 and still be building my zone 2 base. So it's really helpful information to do a blood lactate test to find out what your real threshold is before you bump up past zone 2. And I'll throw in some caveats and everything else. But Joe, we don't know what the hell happened. Do you want to go over like what your results were from your test?
Yeah, so I was kind of the guinea pig. First starting off, we were having some issues and doubts about the meter because it is very finicky. If you ever decide to get this meter, it read up however much you can. You have to be very diligent about how you do it. You have to be really clean, like clean off everything and then dry off everything and then only touch the blood to the strip. It was like all of these things. So
well, let's just tell them exactly, just in case they want to do it, because I couldn't find that information anywhere and I wish someone would have talked about it. So here's how you effectively take a lactate meter. And I'll tell you why we started to get concerned, because the night before the test, I hadn't tested the lactate meter. And I was like, the reason I hadn't tested is because I've done plenty of like blood glucose tests and stuff. I get it. Like you prick your finger, here's a strip, like it's easy. So I didn't think anything of it. And I was like, well, I might as well test it. And the first time I tested it, my reading was 4.6. And I was like, okay, so I'm doing sprint intervals right now. And I was just sitting at my kitchen table. I was like, this isn't right. And then I was sitting at my son's soccer practice later that evening. And I was like, I'll test one more time. And I tested one more time. And I was like, 8.6. So I'm like borderline dying, or I have like leukemia or something. And I was like, okay, something's not right here. And then the guys come over in the morning and I think we tried to do baseline tests, and I don't remember what they were, but they were too high. Everyone was like out of zone 2. Right. And so what we did realize is what Joe was saying is like how you take the sample really, really matters. So you can't have any sweat. You can't have any contaminants or any dirt. So we would clean it off with an alcohol swab. Then we would make sure our finger was dry on a paper towel. We would prick ourselves. And then I learned this from like one of the Amazon reviews, is like you have to discard the first drop of blood. So you squeeze out a drop of blood, get rid of that one, then, only then, after it's clean and all that stuff, you can use that second drop to touch it on the strip. And again, like Joe was saying, you have to like, only the blood should touch the strip. Your finger shouldn't touch the strip. You don't want to smear it on there. It's got to like just barely get the blood into the strip zone and let it like suck the blood into it. Then you'll start to get accurate readings. And so Joe was the test subject 001, and we kind of had to learn through him. But yeah, anyway, the rest of your results.
Yeah, and I almost feel like the meter needs to be calibrated or something. So like I would do like a practice run, like if you're doing a workout every 15, 20 minutes, if you're just getting a meter, then just try it out, do that process, because then you might get the hang of it. Because I think my baseline was like 2.5, and then my first test at the 15-minute mark was like 4.8, and we were like, oh crap, this is not going well. So then I got back on, and at the 30-minute mark, it was like, all right, this is kind of all or nothing, and I got 1.7. It's like, okay, great. And then from there, I just got 1.5s at the 45, and I was like low 50-minute. I didn't go all the way to 60, but it was just like run 60, 160 to 165 plus, and according to Garmin, that's my zone 5 because it's at my own whatever zones. But I did, and I still got 1.5, and I was still actually feeling pretty good during, like even around 155 to 160. I felt pretty fresh. I felt like I could keep going, which is why I still kind of kept going. So I guess that's kind of an accurate indicator, but we're gonna have to do another test in October and maybe change up how the test is done, just to see. And I probably could have tested mine again because I should have had a spike. Apparently, we just didn't get to my spike, and I doubt I can sustain 160 to 165. I just ran this morning with my new totals. It was kind of hard to get up to 150 today, but sustaining 150 was fine. And then I had a zone 4 run, and like it felt pretty hard, and it was hard for me to get up to 155 plus during my like 10 minutes of zone 4 that I was doing. And then I backed it back down, and I was fine. So eager to do another test, but it was pretty cool to see if you really care to put the money into that, or if like maybe you have a group of people and you want to split the cost kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, my results is basically once I got to my zone, according to the meter, I was just really, really efficient at getting rid of my lactate.
Yeah, that's what I think is an inaccurate test, because you'd have to be, I'm not going to say fit, like you're fit. I'm saying you'd have to be like, and we talked about this that day, like you'd be winning the Tour de France, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the level of fitness you'd have to be maintaining, like 165, 170, and you're still clearing lactate efficiently. You'd have to be the most elite endurance athlete that you'd be making. Because think about it, if you could hop on your bike and ride at 175 or 170 and not get tired and not build up any lactate, you'd burn everybody, right? Like you'd just be the most badass athlete on the planet. But that's not reality. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, I think, I don't know what happened with yours, but we got to definitely retest. And that's the beauty of you being the first person to go, is like, we also learned how to test appropriately and everything else.
Yeah. And it's possible that maybe there was a little bit of sweat in that last one. That was when I was like, it's like by the last test, you're pouring sweat. So you have to like avoid where you're dripping. Maybe there was a little bit mixed in and it just read a little bit less, but it didn't come up invalid. I don't know. Cause
we should have retested. We should have taken a second strip and done that one on your third test there.
Cause all the invalids that we got were like 4 something. We're like, no, that's definitely not right. It's obviously not right. But I guess there could be invalid on the low end too. So like Mark at the 45-minute mark, because he was the third one to go, we were smart enough to retest, because his was like 3.3, and then we tested again, and it went down to 1.4. So
yeah. So also know that I think there's a big reason I want to talk about it is like, if you do this and you're getting really crazy readings, don't be scared. Like the strips are expensive, but don't be scared to retest. Like I should have retested Joe on his final test, but we were just kind of like, I was still at the point in mindset of like, this might not even work. This meter might suck. And so when he got like a 1.4 or 1.5, when he had just been running for 15 minutes between 160 and 165, I was like, this whole thing is like bullshit. Like I'm just gonna whatever, but then it worked. Like I was the next person to go, and it worked for me. So anyway, we should have retested him. So not super conclusive on Joe's side, but Mark and I, we were pretty similar. And so what I want to get into is like, does it matter? Should you do it? And I would say it's cool. Like if you're like super nerdy and into fitness stuff and like you want to do something like this, it could be cool to have and like have a super accurate reading. But ultimately, I'm right within the math, what math said I could be, right? Like 145 is my base math zone. But if I answered yes to all the questions in like the math questionnaire, I actually could add up to 10 is what I could get up to. And so math 145 plus 10 is 155, which is essentially where I think I could be now if I want to be. And so, no, I don't think you need to test. I think if you do the math zone and do nothing else, like if you're just starting zone 2, I wouldn't try to like add 5 or subtract, or like I just do like 180 minus my age. I'm going to do that for a couple months. And then after that, if I'm making a lot of progress, then I'll add 5 beats per minute, 10 beats per minute, or you can do a lactate test. But at the end of the day, I'm still right within the math zone. So I don't find the lactate testing necessary, but it took me doing lactate testing to find out that it was kind of unnecessary. I could just use the equation.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of zone 2 for the last at least 3 years. So you've been part of our community for 3 years or so, doing a lot of the zone 2 that we've been doing, and you've going off of regular zone 2, or even you bumped up to the math because we introduced math like 2 years ago or something. So if you've been doing your math for about 2 years, then I would say, and you've been gotten pretty good at it, then I would say, you could probably bump it up 5. But if you're just getting into zone 2, keep it lower, and just really get a hang of that lower zone 2, because you're still going to like zone. There's an upper part of zone 2, but there's still a lower. You're still going to get the benefits of some lower aerobic um, training, but like it's when you go above that it's kind of just like blots out. It's like null. So it's better to err on the side of lower, I would say. And you could counter that if you want, but then to just think, oh, I could probably just bump mine up more.
Oh yeah, and that's what I wanted to talk about in reality, because we were running on a treadmill. I have a true form trainer, so like perfectly flat, right? Like just like a straight shot, like very easy on the muscles. It's a little bit padded, right? So it's not as hard. There's not as much impact. And lactate production also has to do with muscle utilization, because if you're using like typically lifting, those kind of things are going to rely on anaerobic metabolism, like when you're lifting a weight or whatever. And when you're running, there's not as much of that involved. But if you're rowing versus swimming versus cycling, there's, especially with rowing, right? There's a lot more muscle involvement, or the airdyne. So your lactate test could be completely different from running to rowing to anything else. So like you have to caveat all of these things. Like it only really matters within this one test. So for me, what I'm looking at this as this new, like, okay, 155. I'm not trying to run at 155 now. I'm not trying to like keep it at 155, because to go over 155 is going to bump up my lactate and push me out of zone 2. So again, I do agree with you, Joe. Like I want to be more in the middle. And I've used this now in 2 runs since we did this just a couple of days ago. And how I look at it is the only real difference for me is I'm staying probably higher 140s for most of the run. And then if I come up on a hill, I can just kind of run the hill at a good pace now. And I'll only bump up to about 155. And I know I'm still in zone 2. That's been the biggest change for me, because hills in zone 2 used to be just like the worst thing on the planet.
Stop.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't have to, well, when I first started doing it, I had to walk, but I don't have to walk up hills. And so I just would like run super slow, like just a trot up hills to maintain zone 2. Now I can keep a more like moderate pace. And I ran 6 miles this morning at kind of this new pacing. And yeah, I think it's like 3 minutes faster than my pure zone 2, trying to stay around like 148 the whole time without ever budging over it. So I did get to run a little bit faster too, overall time wise. So that's kind of how I'm using it. But you also have to factor in like I said, what form of exercise are you doing? Are you is there more muscle involvement in what you're doing, and those kind of things? Definitely something to consider.
Yeah, I really like this, and It's almost like when we go over studies and we're like, "This is a great first step. I wish they could do this, this, and this." Well, now I think we're doing our own sort of study of, it's very very small sample group, but more testing of this. And I almost want to get like if we can get like a either endurance or lactate specialist because I as we start laying out the chart, I'm curious as to how resting heart rate and max heart rate could factor in and change people's because all of our numbers are the same. We're the same age, so all the math is going to come out to the same. But our resting heart rates and max heart rates are completely different, and that's usually dictates zones a good bit. So I'm really curious how and if those factor in each individual person. But we'll come up with a good test in October when I come down and do the next lactate test.
Yeah, I think max heart rate would be the only thing that actually matters in that question. This is my theory here. I don't think resting heart rate will matter. I mean, because like resting heart rate is it's kind of a useless metric, other than like you're fit if you have a low resting heart rate. It just means your heart's not working as hard, right? But like max heart rate, to do a max heart rate test, I think is because if you actually can't get your heart rate, let's say to 190, you and I are the same age, like I can get it above 190. And if you're just like, I physically can't do it, like no matter what, how many stairs I run you up or like kettlebell swings I have you do consecutively, like it just won't actually get to 190, then yeah, then there should be a difference. But if you can get there and I push you there, so that, I mean, I don't know if you want to come back, but I that would be my next proposed test is like, let's get a true max heart rate test for
I was going to write
Jerred.
it down, and I was just going to keep it to myself. But
yeah, so I think like if you actually can't get it high, that might be something else to look into. Now, one thing I wanted to talk about before we go is pre-exercise fuel in zone 2. And this is kind of this might go against what some people talk about. But I do get questions about like what I eat before zone 2 runs. And what I eat before a zone 2 run is water and electrolytes. Or should I say that's what I consume. Now, if I'm going to go run on a track, I'll have like a scoop of peanut butter and a banana. And that's about it. Because I get a lot of questions about pre-workout fuels and stuff that even came up in our community. People were asking, because one pre-workout fuel I do like is UCAN. I've talked about that one, and we have no affiliation with the company at all. It's just a good carbohydrate supplement. But never ever, and I want to be very clear on this, like never ever would I get in the habit of taking a carbohydrate supplement before every run. And I actually think it might end up screwing you up long term, or it'll become something that you just always have to do. I'm not saying you can't increase fitness if you always have pre-workout. I'm saying I think it might screw up the fact that you just always need that. Because if you look into how the body utilizes fuel, if you shove yourself full of a bunch of carbohydrate, a bunch of glucose, and you're going to do a zone 2 run, your body's going to use whatever's easiest. And so it's going to use the glucose. It's going to be like, well, you gave me a crap ton of this. You gave me 60 grams of carbohydrate before this zone 2 run. I'm just going to use it. And so it will use that because it's the easiest fuel for your body to use. And you can still, when you're at closer to this 2 millimole, your body's using some fat and then some glucose. And it's going to be like, I want to use as much glucose as possible. And again, I'm not trying to get too nerdy here, but the point of zone 2 is aerobic metabolism. And so aerobic metabolism is when you are getting the pyruvate down into the mitochondria, and then the mitochondria is being forced to get better at ATP production, so energy production through the mitochondria. I want that process to happen fasted. I don't want any glucose. I want my body to get better at burning fat, which is what happens at zone 2. I want to stress my mitochondria. I want to get better at burning fat and utilizing that for energy. So I just wanted to be clear on that. Like, I'm not saying pre-exercise carbohydrates are bad. If you're doing any kind of weightlifting, anything where you're doing anaerobic metabolism, you're doing, like I said, a track run, like faster repeats, by all means, go get your carbs in, do your carbohydrate supplements if you have to, or just eat a banana like I do. But if you're really trying to get better at zone 2, and we're moving outside of just performance, and we're talking more like longevity and health, I am of the mindset right now, unless something comes out and changes my mind, but I'm of the mindset right now that you should absolutely do your zone 2 cardio fasted, again, to better utilize fat for fuel and to stress the mitochondria and get it better at producing energy, ATP. So that is my 2 cents on whether or not you should take a pre-workout carbohydrate supplement, because that was a big conversation in the Garage Gym Athlete community last week.
So for our training and what we're doing, we're only doing zone 2 for probably an hour. But for those athletes that are either training longer or trying to, maybe some of ours that want to do like a half marathon or a marathon, at what point would you eat or have some sort of carb or supplement? Would it be like you start the first hour or something fasted, or just electrolytes and then add, or start off and add?
And we're talking about like if I'm doing an event.
Yeah.
If I'm doing an event, I don't care about stressing my mitochondria, and because to me that's all training, right? And so I would start, if I went to go do a race tomorrow, I would carb load today, and I would take a carbohydrate supplement or eat carbs in the morning before doing it, and then I would fuel throughout the event. So that, again, that's like on the performance side. Performance, I always want fuel, but when I'm training, I want to practice being able to utilize fat more. That way, I really feel like you start to rely on that so heavily. And this is something I really learned when I was big into cycling and started testing all this stuff. Was I would always have pre-workout. That's kind of got drilled into my head. And I think if you come from more of like a bodybuilding style training, which I did a long time ago, that there's always like the pre-workout meal or like whatever. You're always thinking in that capacity and amongst those lines. And so you kind of take that over to your endurance, and you're like, okay, what am I going to eat before this? But ultimately, what would happen on my cycling rides is I would be out of zone 2 and I'd very quickly run out of energy. Like I would be, or even be in zone 2 and I'd run out of energy and I would bonk, and like my performance would suck. And then I realized some simple carbohydrates fix that problem. But then I also started to realize over time, if I keep my intensity lower and I have nothing, I can still do a 2-hour ride, and my body will just burn fat, because you got tons of fat that your body stores. It can store a lot more fat than it can carbohydrate. And so I just think that, those are the 2 different instances for me. Is like, if you're only ever looking for performance, cool, load yourself up with carbs all the time. But if you actually want to train longevity, performance, mitochondria efficiency, all those kind of things, I think you should do your zone 2 fasted.
Cool.
Yeah. And if you are training for longer stuff, you definitely have a fueling strategy. That's not what I'm saying. We covered that. It's called the Weekend Warrior Fueling Series. I think we just had that on the cool downs, but it was a 3-part series. When did we do that? Like 2019, 2020?
Yeah, 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, it's been a while, but like we went in depth over 3 different podcast episodes about protein considerations, carbohydrate considerations, like everything for fueling for these types of events. So if you want to nerd out on that stuff, we already have with 3 1-hour episodes. So go check those out. But I think we will end this one. At the end of the day, my takeaway for the Garage Gym Athlete is just do your math zone. That was probably the coolest thing, because in my mind, that's all there really is, right? There's the math zone. But there's the other zone too that people play with, where they just take their max heart rate and they do 60 to 70% of it. If I was doing that, or if most people were doing that, you might be way off what the math would calculate. So you might be running in a zone 2 that's just like completely unsustainable. So the coolest thing that for me to see was, like, we talk about math all the time. That's what we've been telling our athletes to do for a couple of years. And it actually worked out, at least in our instances, that math kind of held its ground on even up to a blood lactate test for zone 2. So if you don't want to do the test, save a couple $100 and buying all the equipment and just do the math stuff. That's my ultimate takeaway.
Yep.
But that's it for this one. Thanks for watching or listening. If you have been listening to the podcast for a while, you like our content, please 5-star review and positive comment really helps the show out, helps it reach more people, and we would really appreciate that. And if you're on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, leave us a comment. Love the comments we are getting right now, and we're publishing. Like I said, we're gonna have some more YouTube only content coming out from this lactate stuff. If you want to dive into this more, definitely check us out on YouTube. We're Garage Gym Athlete. And if you want to get into our training, Easy to do. Just go to garagegymathlete.com, sign up for a free trial. We would love to have you. And remember, if you don't kill comfort, comfort will kill you.